What frightens a child from the news depends almost entirely on their age. Welcome to this explainer. If you're a parent, you've absolutely felt that pit in your stomach when a breaking news alert flashes on the TV while your kids are in the room. You immediately think, did they see that? Are they scared? What on earth do I say right now? Well, today we're diving into the hard science of media fright to really understand how children process crises and exactly how you can help them navigate it. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover how age changes everything, seeing versus understanding, who's most vulnerable, and then we'll dive into actionable playbooks for both young children and older kids, wrapping up with knowing exactly when to get professional help.
All right, part 1, age changes everything. Let's get into the science of media fright.
To really figure out how to protect our kids, we've got to look at the work of Joanne Cantor. She is essentially the ultimate authority on developmental differences when it comes to media fright. And to put the scale of this research into perspective, just look at this number, 1,560. That's how many children had their fright reactions documented in a massive 2022 national U.S. study by Cantor and Kristen Harrison, which specifically looked at COVID-19 news. And what they found was a clear, completely indisputable pattern. A child's developmental stage is absolutely the biggest factor in what scares them.
And the stakes here, they're incredibly high. 36. That is the number of disaster media studies reviewed by Pfefferbaum and colleagues. And the data across all of those studies proves one absolutely crucial point. A heavy dose of disaster-related media viewing is directly linked to post-traumatic stress symptoms, anxiety, and general distress in youth. Look, a passing glance is one thing, right? But repetitive exposure? That causes real, measurable psychological distress.
Moving on to part 2. Seeing versus understanding. This is the core developmental difference.
So this is where we really break down exactly how fear works in a kid's brain. For the younger ones, we're talking preschool and early elementary, their fear is completely driven by vivid, immediate visuals. They are terrified by what things literally look or sound like. Think scary images, incredibly loud sirens, or just monstrous appearances, even if the actual threat isn't realistic at all. But older children and adolescents, they've outgrown that. They are frightened by abstract and realistic threats. They get scared by the actual meaning and the likelihood of an event, things like war or disease.
For those older kids and teens, their fear essentially boils down to just one quiet, honestly terrifying question: could this happen to me? They are mentally calculating the probability of a disaster striking their own lives, their own school, or their own family. They actually understand the real-world implications. So, while you might be comforting a 5-year-old about some scary noise on the TV, you have to comfort a 12-year-old about the actual geopolitical or health crisis that the TV is reporting on. It's a completely different ballgame.
Which brings us to part 3. Who is most vulnerable? Let's talk about the amplifiers of fear.
There are some very specific amplifiers of fear that we as parents absolutely need to watch out for. First up, heavy, repetitive media exposure. As we saw from that Pfefferbaum review, repetition is just toxic. Second, that COVID-19 study showed us that children who have digital devices in their bedrooms exhibit much greater fear. But perhaps the single most critical amplifier is pre-existing anxiety. A really landmark study by Otto and colleagues that looked at children's media exposure right after 9/11 found that already anxious children are significantly more vulnerable to media-induced post-traumatic symptoms. The evidence-based advice here is super simple. You've got to know your child, because if they're naturally prone to anxiety, they are definitely going to need a much stronger shield from disaster coverage.
All right, part 4. The playbook for young children. These are your actionable steps for kids ages 3 to 7. Since this youngest age group is so incredibly sensitive to visual triggers, our whole strategy here is about managing their physical environment. So first up on the do list, limit those graphic visuals immediately. If a scary image pops up on the screen, just turn it off or change the channel. Break that visual contact. Then, keep your safety reassurance extremely concrete and short. At this age, they do not need a lecture on the global supply chain or the mechanics of a hurricane, right? They just need to know that they are physically safe right there in their immediate room. And on the flip side, here are the absolute don'ts for your preschoolers and early elementary kids. Please, don't leave the news running in the background. I know it's incredibly easy to just leave the TV on while you're making dinner, but those flashing red breaking news graphics and those tense dramatic musical stings, those are perceptual nightmares for young brains. And definitely don't expose them to repetitive disaster coverage, because seeing a building collapse 10 times on a news loop feels to a 4-year-old like 10 completely different buildings are collapsing. Actually, I want you to memorize this exact concrete script for the next time your little one sees something terrifying. Seriously, say it with me. We are safe. That happened far away. Grown-ups are helping. It is so simple, but it hits all the major psychological checkpoints for a 3 to 7-year-old. It establishes immediate physical safety. It creates spatial distance from the threat. And it reassures them that capable adults are in control. It works brilliantly.
Now, moving on to Part 5, the playbook for older kids, actionable steps for ages 8 to 16. These older kids, they've got the cognitive maturity to understand reality, right? So that requires a completely different approach from us. Do address their realistic worry honestly. Whatever you do, do not dismiss their fears. Instead, discuss probability and control. Help them contextualize the event. If they're worried about a new disease, sit down and talk about the actual statistics and the preventative measures your specific family is taking. Explain what scientists, governments, or local communities are doing to help. You're basically shifting their focus away from the sheer terror and redirecting it toward the mechanics of the solution.
And the don'ts for these older kids are just as critical. Number 1, don't over-reassure them with falsehoods. I mean, if a teenager asks if a war could impact the economy, and you just casually say, nope, everything is perfect forever, they are going to see right through you. Fake reassurances completely break trust. Also, don't let them consume disaster media alone. Watch it with them. Be right there to provide the context so their imaginations don't just run wild in isolation.
Now, regardless of your child's age, there are a few universal steps that just work across the board. Step 1, turn off repetitive coverage. That rule literally never expires. Step 2, watch together and actively invite questions, making sure to answer honestly, but at their specific developmental level. And Step 3, which is just incredibly powerful, channel their worry into action. Fear almost always stems from a feeling of powerlessness. So, having your child draw a card for a victim, or donate a tiny amount of their allowance, or even help create a family safety plan, that actively restores their sense of control.
Finally, Part 6, knowing when to get help by spotting persistent trauma symptoms. Look, while media exposure is a huge factor in distress, sometimes we do absolutely everything right and a kid still struggles. It happens. If you start observing these symptoms following exposure to scary news, it really may be time to seek out a professional. Look out for persistent nightmares that repeatedly disrupt their sleep over time. Watch for hypervigilance, which is the state of being constantly tense, always on guard, or easily startled. And pay very close attention to avoidance behaviors, like suddenly refusing to go to school, refusing to sleep alone, or avoiding anything that even mildly reminds them of the news event. If these symptoms are sticking around, the evidence strongly suggests reaching out to a mental health professional for some tailored support.
And honestly, this brings us to our ultimate goal, turning all that anxiety into actual empowerment. As we wrap up this explainer, just remember that channeling worry into action is by far your most effective tool. Fear Me Not helps kids conquer fears through science-backed play, taking the really abstract terrors of the world and giving children tangible ways to process them. Look, we can't shield our kids from every single bad headline out there, but we can completely change how they process them. So I'll leave you with this final thought. The next time breaking news flashes across your screen, are you going to let the media dictate your child's reality? Or will you use their age to unlock their resilience?